A former NBA player just threw a spotlight on one of the most uncomfortable questions in women's basketball. And the reason this hit so hard is not because it came from some anonymous account online. It came from Enes Kanter Freedom, a former NBA lottery pick, a player with a national profile, a player who knows exactly how to create attention, and now a player who says he has read the WNBA's own eligibility language and is using it to force a question the league clearly does not want to answer in public. That is what makes this story different, because this is not just another online argument. It is not just another political debate floating around sports media for 24 hours. It is a challenge, a public challenge aimed directly at the league's rules, the league's language, and the league's willingness to clearly define what it actually means when it says who is eligible to play. And whether you agree with Enes Kanter Freedom or not, he has done one thing very effectively. He has forced a much larger audience to look at a question the WNBA would probably rather keep vague. So let's break this down carefully. What Enes actually did, why people say he exposed a weakness in the WNBA's wording, how Sophie Cunningham fits into this, why Brittney Griner keeps getting pulled into the wider argument, and why Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever keep ending up near the center of every major identity debate the league seems to face right now. Because once you strip away the noise, this is not really about one man trying to join one league, it is about clarity. And right now, clarity is exactly what the WNBA seems least interested in giving. What Enes Kanter Freedom actually did. The reason this spread so fast is because Enes did not frame it like a joke. That matters. If he had posted one sarcastic line and moved on, this would have died in a few hours. Instead, he framed it like a challenge to the internal logic of the league. He said he had reviewed the WNBA's eligibility criteria. He said he and his team had looked at the current framework around self-identification and inclusion. And he said that based on the existing language, he was declaring himself eligible for the upcoming WNBA draft. Now, whether that declaration would ever survive any real review process is not the main point. The point is that he forced people to ask a much simpler question. If the WNBA says only women are eligible to play, how exactly does the league define that term in its governing language? That is the crack he pushed on. Not with a leaked memo, not with secret inside information, with the league's own wording. That is why the story caught fire, because once somebody high-profile publicly tests a vague rule, vagueness itself becomes the headline, and that is exactly what the WNBA now has to deal with. The rule problem. This is where the story moves from provocation to something more serious. According to the argument being made, the WNBA's language says that only women are eligible to play, but it does not clearly define what that means inside the document in a way the public can easily point to. That is the issue. And this is what makes Enes' challenge effective, even if nobody believes he will ever actually step on a WNBA floor. He is not trying to prove he belongs in the league. He is trying to prove that the league's wording can be publicly stress-tested. That is a much stronger move, because institutions often rely on vague, flexible language when they want room to maneuver. That works until someone decides to read the language literally, say, fine, let's test it, and force the institution to either clarify the rule or look like it is hiding behind ambiguity. That is exactly the corner the WNBA is now in. If the league ignores them, it looks evasive. If it responds unclearly, it looks unprepared. If it responds clearly, it is forced into a politically explosive conversation it may have preferred to keep abstract. That is why this matters, not because Enes is likely to become a real prospect, but because he turned a cultural argument into a rulebook argument. And rulebook arguments are much harder for leagues to dance around. Why Sophie Cunningham is part of the story. This is where Sophie Cunningham enters the picture, because Enes did not create this tension out of thin air. He stepped into a conversation that was already boiling. A few weeks earlier, Sophie Cunningham had been asked to expand on her views about protecting girls in women's sports. She did not evade it. She did not retreat into polished non-answers. She said what she believed. She said she believed girls should be protected in sport. She tied that belief to fairness in Title IX. She said she would stand by it. And when reporters followed up, she did not back away. That matters because her comments changed the emotional atmosphere around this debate. Sophie's position turned a lot of private opinion into public conflict. Some people praised her immediately, others condemned her immediately, but almost nobody ignored her. That is the real shift. Before Sophie, a lot of this lived in the background. After Sophie, it moved into the forefront. And once it moved into the foreground, someone like Enes Kanter Freedom was always going to see the opening. Because what Sophie did culturally, he then did procedurally. She made the issue visible. He made it testable. That is why these two stories are connected. Why the WNBA is in such an awkward spot. This is not a normal public relations challenge, because the WNBA is trying to hold together several things at once. It wants to be inclusive, it wants to be modern, it wants to grow its audience, it wants to be seen as values-driven, it wants to protect its cultural identity, and it wants to avoid becoming the center of a non-stop national culture war cycle. Those goals do not always fit together cleanly. That is the problem. When the league speaks broadly about inclusion, it sounds generous and forward-looking, but if the specific rule language behind those values is too vague, people start asking whether the league is governing by philosophy rather than by clearly defined standards. That is what Enes has exposed. Again, not necessarily by proving a loophole in some final legal sense, but by proving that the public can look at the rulebook and feel the ambiguity for itself. That is a problem for the league, because once sports fans smell ambiguity in a high conflict issue, they stop trusting the institution to explain itself honestly. And in a league already struggling to manage multiple public controversies at once, that is the last thing you want. Why Brittney Griner gets pulled into the debate. Now we get to the most combustible part of the story. Brittney Griner. This is where things get heated very quickly, and it is important to be careful. A lot of online content around Griner gets reckless fast. Rumors get repeated like facts, speculation gets presented like proof, and once that happens, the entire conversation gets uglier and weaker at the same time. That is not the strongest version of the story. The stronger version is this. Griner has become one of the symbolic figures through whom the public argues about much bigger issues than just basketball. Fairness, gender, women's sports, league identity, who gets protected, who gets centered. That is why her name surfaces so quickly whenever these debates erupt, not because every rumor about her is credible, but because she already occupies symbolic weight inside the public imagination. And once Sophie Cunningham's comments entered the spotlight, and once Enes Kanter Freedom escalated the rulebook challenge, people immediately began pulling Griner back into the center of it all. That says more about the public debate than it does about one person. It shows you that certain athletes are no longer being discussed only as players. They are being discussed as symbols, and symbols attract conflict. Why Caitlin Clark keeps ending up in the middle, and then there is Caitlin Clark, because somehow, no matter where the controversy starts, her orbit gets pulled into it. She did not create this eligibility debate. She did not make Sophie Cunningham's comments. She did not ask Enes Kanter Freedom to do this, and yet she still becomes part of the story. Why? Because Clark is now the league's biggest visibility engine. Everything bends toward the most visible person. If Sophie says something controversial, people connect it to Clark because Sophie is one of the most publicly identified teammates and defenders in her corner. If Griner becomes part of a fairness debate, people connect it to Clark because so many fans already interpret the league through the question of how Clark is treated physically, culturally, and institutionally. If Enes takes a shot at the WNBA's rules, he brings Clark and the Fever into the frame because they are the team and the star most associated with the league's new era of attention. That is the pattern. Caitlin Clark is now the WNBA's pressure point. Not because she wants to be, but because that is what happens when one player becomes the central to the league's current relevance. It means controversies do not stay isolated. They start curving back toward her even when she is not the one driving them. And that is one of the clearest signs that the WNBA is still adjusting to the scale of what Clark's presence has done to the sport. This is really about a league in transition. The biggest mistake people can make is thinking this is only a story about one supposed loophole. It is not. This is a story about a league in transition. The WNBA wants mainstream growth. It wants bigger deals. It wants larger audiences. It wants more influence. And it is getting those things. But growth creates pressure. It creates new scrutiny. It creates harder questions. It creates audiences that do not all agree with each other. It creates moments where broad principles have to become clear policies. That is what is happening now. For years, the WNBA could operate in a more protected cultural space, a smaller audience, a narrower public conversation, less national confrontation. Those days are gone. Caitlin Clark helped accelerate that change. Sophie Cunningham sharpened the debate, and now Enes Kanter Freedom has taken the conversation and aimed it straight at the league's rules. That is why this moment matters, because it reveals a league whose language, identity, and growth strategy are not perfectly aligned. And when those things are out of sync, public stress tests become inevitable. Why this is dangerous for the WNBA. The danger here is not that Enes Kanter Freedom will actually end up in a WNBA uniform. The danger is that the league now looks like it does not fully control its own narrative. That is much worse, because once public trust starts slipping, every future debate becomes harder to manage. Every vague statement gets examined harder. Every silence gets interpreted more suspiciously. Every inconsistency becomes another headline. That is already happening to the WNBA in multiple areas. Officiating, player treatment, public messaging, and now eligibility language. This is what happens when a league's business growth starts outpacing the precision of its structure and communication. The audience gets bigger faster than the internal system becomes clearer. That is the instability people are reacting to, and Enes understood that. That is why his move landed, not because he is likely to succeed in any literal basketball sense, but because he exposed uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison for sports institutions trying to project control. The real question the league now has to answer. At the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. The WNBA now has to decide whether it is willing to clarify its standards in a way that is legally, culturally, and politically durable. That is the real test, not dunking on Enes, not hoping the news cycle moves on, not pretending the public did not notice the vagueness. The public noticed, and once people notice that your values language and your rulebook language may not line up perfectly, they start asking harder questions. That is what this whole thing is really about. Not one player, not one provocation, not one viral post. Clarity. Who qualifies? How is that defined? And does the league have the courage to say it out loud in plain terms? That is the question now hanging over all of this. And the longer the WNBA avoids giving a clean answer, the more moments like this will keep happening. The real takeaway. So, what actually happened here? A former NBA player used the WNBA's own language to force an uncomfortable question into the open. Sophie Cunningham helped create the conditions for that question to become urgent by refusing to back down from what she believes. Brittney Griner's name keeps getting pulled into the story because she now carries symbolic weight inside a much bigger public argument. And Caitlin Clark keeps ending up near the center of it all because she is the league's biggest magnet for attention, pressure, and narrative gravity. That is the real story, not whether Enes Kanter Freedom will actually play in the WNBA. He won't need to for this to matter, because the point was never really to join the league. The point was to make the league answer, and right now that is exactly what it looks least prepared to do.